The silence of the castle was a different thing now. For centuries, it had been a silence of power, of absolute authority that required no announcement. It was the quiet of stone and history, a stillness that held the weight of 1,000 years. Now, it was just empty. It was a hollow, aching void that echoed the shape of the one person who had managed to fill it with light. 6 days. It had been 6 days since Matthias had found the note on the pillow of their vast, cold bed. The paper had been impossibly fragile in his hand, a single sheet that had undone his entire world. Her script, a graceful, looping cursive he had once found charmingly archaic, had been stark and brutally simple. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. Goodbye, Matthias." He had not believed it at first. Disbelief was a king's prerogative, a shield forged in arrogance and power. She would return. It was a fit of pique, a moment of human fragility that would pass. He was Matthias, the sovereign of the shadowed realms, the undying king. His mate did not simply leave, but the sun had set and risen 6 times, and the space beside him in the bed remained a cavern of cold linen. Her scent, that impossible, intoxicating blend of lavender and sunlight that had been his anchor, was fading from the silks, a ghost of a memory he chased in his sleep. His counselors spoke to him in hushed, careful tones, their eyes flicking towards the empty chair beside his throne. His power, once absolute, felt like a threadbare cloak. What was a king without his queen? What was a man without his heart? It was on the 7th night, in a bout of grief so profound it felt like a physical sickness, that he had torn her rooms apart. Not in anger, but in a desperate, frantic search for a piece of her he might have missed. A clue, another note, anything to explain the chasm that had opened in his existence. He'd found it tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her private study, a place he hadn't entered in. He couldn't remember how long. It was a simple leather-bound journal, unadorned and worn at the edges. Her diary. He had known she kept one, had seen her writing in it in the early days. Her brow furrowed in concentration, a small smile on her lips. He'd thought it a quaint human habit. He had never once asked to read it. He sank to the floor, the book feeling like a lead weight in his hands. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight piercing the gloom, illuminating the worn leather. His hands, which could snap a man's neck without effort, trembled as he opened it. The first page was dated 2 years ago, a week after the mating bond had snapped into place, a celestial fire that had seared both their souls. Her handwriting was a burst of unrestrained joy. The ink was bold, the loops exuberant, and the words shattered him. September 14th. He looked at me today. That was it. Just 6 words. But he remembered the moment with a clarity that was both a blessing and a curse. They had been in the royal gardens. He had been discussing trade routes with a visiting dignitary, the conversation dry and tedious. And then he had turned, and his eyes had found her across the rose bushes. She was watching a butterfly, her head tilted, a lock of honey-blonde hair falling across her cheek. The bond had hummed between them, a living, breathing thing, and in that instant, the trade routes, the dignitary, the entire world had ceased to exist. There was only her. He had seen the universe in the soft curve of her smile. He had looked at her, truly looked, and she had felt it. She had turned, her blue eyes wide and luminous, and had offered him a smile so radiant it had stolen the breath from his ancient lungs. He had forgotten, until this very moment, what that felt like. He had forgotten the beginning. Holding her diary, he felt the first, terrifying inkling that he had forgotten everything else that mattered too. He read on, turning the pages with a reverence he usually reserved for sacred texts. The early entries were a chronicle of hope, a testament to the miracle she felt their connection to be. Each page was a small, treasured moment that he had lived but had not truly marked. September 20th. We had dinner on the western balcony. Matthias dismissed the staff and served the wine himself. His hands are so steady, so graceful for all their strength. He told me about the constellations of the winter sky, naming stars that died before my own ancestors were born. I felt so small, but not in a bad way. Small like a single perfect shell, held in the palm of a god. He makes me feel safe. October 3rd. He brought me a first edition of my favorite book. He must have sent his agents halfway across the world for it. He didn't make a grand show of it, just left it on my bedside table. When I thanked him, he just smiled and said, "I listen when you speak, Isla." My heart did a foolish little flip. I think it's been flipping ever since I met him. December 12th. It snowed today, the first real snow of the season. He promised we'd walk in it. He came to my rooms and wrapped me in a cloak lined with ermine. It felt like being hugged by a cloud. We walked for an hour, my hand in his. He's so warm. I never feel the cold when I'm with him. He caught a snowflake on his tongue and laughed. A real, genuine laugh. The sound echoed in the stillness. I think I'll hear it in my dreams forever. I am the luckiest woman alive. Matthias closed his eyes, the leather of the book cool against his feverish skin. He remembered these moments, but as if through a thick pane of glass. They were facts, events that had occurred. But reading her words, he felt the raw, unfiltered emotion of them for the first time. He had been the center of her universe, the source of a joy so pure and profound it illuminated every line she wrote. The guilt was a slow, creeping poison. He had held a star in his hands and had been too preoccupied to notice its light. He continued to read, the narrative of their life unfolding through her eyes. The entries were a mirror, reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized. A man who was present, attentive, and deeply in love. He saw the man she had fallen for, and he mourned him. Because as he turned the pages, as weeks bled into months, a subtle shift began. The ink seemed less certain, the loops of her script tighter, more controlled. The unbridled joy began to be tempered with a fragile, hopeful patience. March 5th. Matthias had to cancel our dinner tonight. A last-minute meeting with the border lords. I understand, of course. He has a kingdom to run. I waited for him in the library. I wore the blue dress he likes, the one he says matches my eyes. He came in just after midnight, looking so tired. He kissed my forehead and went straight to his study. He didn't notice the dress. A cold knot formed in Matthias's stomach. He remembered that night. The border lords had been tedious, their grievances petty. He had been exhausted, his mind already on the next day's docket. He remembered seeing her in the library, a fleeting impression of blue, but he hadn't truly registered it. He had seen a figure, not his mate, not Isla. The entries continued, each one a small paper cut on his soul. The shift was insidious, a slow erosion of connection he had been utterly blind to. May 22nd. I tried to tell him about the new rose I'm cultivating, the one I want to name after his mother. He was reading a report from the chancellor. He nodded and said, "That's nice, my love," but his eyes never left the page. I don't think he heard a single word I said. I stood there for a full minute, and he never looked up. I felt transparent. August 16th. Today is the anniversary of our first walk in the snow. I mentioned it this morning. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes before he smoothed it over. He'd forgotten. He apologized, of course, and promised a special dinner to make up for it. But the apology felt like another duty he had to perform. The spontaneity, the joy, where did it go? Or was it only ever on my side? He could feel her hope fraying page by page. The diary, once a celebration, was becoming a logbook of his failures. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking account of his growing distance. He saw the pattern now with sickening clarity. The weight of his crown, the endless demands of his court, the centuries of habit and solitude he had fallen back into. They had become a wall between them, a wall he had built brick by brick with every missed dinner, every forgotten promise, every conversation where he had been physically present but emotionally 1,000 miles away. He had taken her for granted. The bond which had felt so miraculous, so unbreakable, he had treated as a given, a permanent fixture of his life that required no maintenance. He had assumed her light would just keep shining, without ever realizing he was the one casting the shadows that were slowly extinguishing it. Grief was a physical architect, rebuilding the castle around him into a mausoleum of his own making. The grand halls were no longer symbols of his power, but vast, empty spaces that mocked his solitude. The throne room, where he had commanded armies and decided the fates of nations, was just a room with 2 chairs, one of them achingly, permanently vacant. His immortality, once his greatest strength, now stretched before him as an eternity of this emptiness, a punishment of his own design. He spent his nights in her study, the diary his only companion. He read it from cover to cover, then started again. Each reading was a fresh flagellation. He saw now that her love for him had not been a passive state of being. It had been an active daily effort. She had tried for so long to bridge the distance he was creating. October 29th. I tried to talk to him tonight. I asked if he was unhappy. He looked so surprised. He cupped my face and told me that I was his queen, his mate, the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. He said all the right words. But his eyes, they were looking at an idea of me, not at me. It was like he was reciting a creed he was supposed to believe. I wanted to scream, "Then see me, please, just see me." But I just smiled and said I was being foolish. The silence after he left was the loudest sound I've ever heard. January 8th. He was talking with the Chancellor in the Great Hall. I approached to let him know his supper was ready. He didn't stop his conversation. He gestured for me to wait, his eyes fixed on the Chancellor, his expression intent. He was looking in my direction, but not at me. He was looking through me, as if I were a pane of glass he needed to peer through to see the more important person on the other side. The Chancellor looked uncomfortable. I just turned and walked away. Neither of them noticed. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice in his chest. He had done that. He remembered the conversation, some tedious matter of tariffs. He remembered Isla's presence as a fleeting interruption, a minor detail in the larger, more important tapestry of his duties. He had dismissed her, his mate. He had made her feel like a servant in her own home, in their shared life. He had prized his kingdom over his queen. And in his blindness, he had lost them both. The kingdom was just stone and politics. Isla had been its soul. He forced himself to read to the end, to swallow every last drop of the poison he had brewed. The entries became shorter, less frequent. The vibrant, hopeful script was gone, replaced by tight, spidery letters that barely seemed to touch the page, as if she were afraid of leaving a mark. The ink was faded in places, smudged as if by tears. February 15th. I spent the day in the village market. No one knows who I am there. I'm just a woman buying bread and cheese, a woman who exists. The baker smiled at me. The woman selling flowers told me I had a lovely laugh. Strangers. They saw me more clearly today than my own husband has in months. It was a relief, and that thought is the most heartbreaking thing of all. March 1st. I stood by the window and watched him train with the royal guard in the courtyard for an hour. He is magnificent, a whirlwind of deadly grace. He never once looked up. And then, the final entry. The day before she vanished. The date was seared into his memory. He had come back from a long, grueling trip to the Northern Territories. He had been exhausted and irritable. She had been waiting for him in their chambers, wearing a simple white gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had looked ethereal, a spirit of the moon. He had brushed past her, muttering something about needing a bath and a drink, his mind already on the mountain of correspondence awaiting him. He hadn't even met her eyes. The entry was just 2 sentences. The ink was stark against the cream-colored page. March 9th. He looked through me today, like I wasn't even there. I can't remember the last time he truly saw me. I'm done being invisible. The book fell from his hands. The sound was a dull thud on the ancient rug, but it echoed in the silence like a death knell. Done being invisible. She hadn't left him out of anger or spite. She hadn't run off with another. She had left because he had made her cease to exist. He had erased her, slowly, methodically, with his carelessness and his neglect. The goodbye note hadn't been an act of cruelty. It had been an act of survival. She had left to find a place where she could be real again. A roar of pure, undiluted agony tore itself from his throat, a sound more beast than man. It ripped through the castle, a wave of despair that sent servants scattering and guards clutching their weapons. He was on his knees, the polished floor cold against his skin, his body racked with sobs that had been held back for centuries. He wept for her, for the bright, hopeful girl in the first half of the diary. He wept for himself, for the blind, arrogant fool he had been. And he wept for the love he had carelessly, stupidly, unforgivably suffocated. When the storm of grief finally passed, a chilling calm settled over him. The pain was still there, a permanent fixture in the landscape of his soul. But now it had a purpose. It was not the end. It could not be. He picked up the diary, his hands steady now. This book was not just a record of his failure. It was a map. It was a guide back to the woman he had lost. He would not just find her. That was the easy part. A simple matter of tracking and power. No, he would do what he should have done all along. He would learn to see her. He would memorize every word she had written, every joy he had given her, and every pain he had inflicted. He would hold her entire heart in his mind, and then he would go and lay it at her feet. He stood, the diary clutched in his hand. The hunt had begun, but he was not hunting a fugitive. He was on a pilgrimage to find his own soul. The search was an exercise in methodical agony. For 6 months, Matthias tore a path across the continent, a phantom of focused intent. He shed the trappings of his kingship, trading his crown for a traveler's cloak and his scepter for the worn leather diary that never left his side. His council ruled in his stead, communicating through coded messages delivered by night flyers, but his mind was far from matters of state. His entire world had contracted to a single desperate purpose: Isla. He moved with a predator's patience, following whispers and rumors, tracing the faint ghost of her passage. She was clever, leaving a trail just substantial enough to be followed but never easily. A bookseller in a bustling port city remembered a quiet woman with sad blue eyes, who bought poetry and paid in cash. A tavern owner in a mountain village recalled her working for a week, washing dishes in exchange for a room, before vanishing into the morning mist. Each near miss was a fresh twist of the knife, a reminder of how determined she was to remain lost to him. During the long days on horseback and the even longer nights in cheap roadside inns, he read the diary. He read it until the pages grew soft and pliant with the oils of his hands, until the ink began to fade. He didn't just read the words. He inhaled them, absorbed them, made them a part of his very being. He committed every line to memory, every date, every fleeting emotion she had recorded. He learned the rhythm of her hope and the cadence of her despair. He caught a snowflake on his tongue and laughed. He would close his eyes and force himself to hear that laugh, not as a memory, but as the precious, priceless thing she had declared it to be. He didn't notice the dress. He would picture the blue fabric, the way it would have shimmered in the library's firelight, and he would let the shame of his blindness wash over him, a necessary and purifying penance. The diary became his breviary, his prayer book. It was a constant, brutal reminder of his sins, but it was also the only connection he had left to her. In memorizing her pain, he felt he was beginning, in some small way, to share its weight. He was learning her language, the language of small moments and quiet hurts, a language he had been deaf to for too long. His ancient vampiric senses, honed to track the scent of blood across a battlefield, were being retrained. He was learning to hunt for the scent of lavender, for the echo of a soft voice, for the lingering presence of a broken heart. The trail finally led him to the sea, a tiny forgotten town clinging to the edge of a windswept peninsula, a place called Saltwind. It smelled of brine and damp stone and frying fish. The gulls cried a lonely, keening song overhead. It was a place for endings and beginnings, a place where one could easily disappear. It was perfect. He spent the first 2 days just watching, learning the rhythms of the town. He was a shadow in the alleyways, a silent observer on the cobbled streets. He learned which baker made the best bread, which fisherman brought in the first catch, which pub was the rowdiest on a Saturday night. He was mapping her new world, trying to understand the life she had built from the ashes of the one he had burned down. And on the 3rd day, he found her. She was working in a small, cluttered bookshop called The Turning Page. The name was so apt it was a physical blow. He saw her through the wavy, salt-grimed glass of the front window. She was wearing a simple gray wool dress and a thick knitted shawl the color of the sea. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, and a pair of spectacles was perched on her nose. She looked different. Not diminished, but changed. There were faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but there was also a quiet solidity to her posture, a self-possession he had never seen in the gilded halls of his castle. She was real here. She was visible. His unbeating heart, a dead, useless thing for centuries, gave a painful lurch, a phantom pang of life. He wanted to storm the shop, to fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness, to pull her into his arms and never let go. But the words from the diary echoed in his mind, a ghostly chorus of caution. I felt transparent. He looked through me. A grand theatrical gesture was what the old Matthias would have done. It would have been about his pain, his needs. This had to be about her. It had to be quiet. It had to be earned. So he waited. He took a room in a small inn overlooking the harbor, a room with a window that, if he craned his neck, offered a sliver of a view of the bookshop's front door. For a week, he did nothing but watch. It was the most difficult, excruciating thing he had ever done. He watched her open the shop in the morning, her movements methodical and sure. He watched her recommend books to the townspeople, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips as she spoke. He saw her share a joke with the baker's wife, who brought her a warm roll every afternoon. He saw her sitting in the window seat during quiet moments, reading, her expression one of calm absorption. He was learning her all over again. Or perhaps for the very first time. He saw that she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. He saw that she had a habit of pushing her spectacles up her nose with her index finger, even when they weren't slipping. He noticed a new freckle just beside her left eyebrow. These were tiny, insignificant details, the kind of things a lover should know, the kind of things he had been utterly blind to. Each new observation was both a joy and a fresh wound. He was finally seeing her, but he was seeing her from the outside, a stranger looking in. He memorized her schedule. She closed the shop at 5, walked the long way home along the cliff path, and let herself into a small cottage set back from the sea, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. She was building a life here, a small, quiet, real life, and he was the ghost haunting its edges. The diary in his coat felt heavier with each passing day, a testament to the world he had destroyed and the fragile peace he was about to shatter. On the 8th day, he knew he could wait no longer. The fear was a living thing inside him, a cold dread that far surpassed any physical threat he had ever faced. He could face down armies, challenge ancient demons, but the thought of the look in her eyes when she saw him, the fear, the hatred, the indifference, it threatened to paralyze him. He took the diary from his coat, its leather cover as familiar as his own skin, and tucked it securely in an inner pocket. It was his shield and his confession, his indictment and his plea. He waited until she was closing the shop. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The wind was picking up, carrying the salty tang of the incoming tide. He watched her turn the sign on the door from open to closed, her movements weary. She locked the door and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, turning to begin her walk home. He stepped out of the alleyway across the street. He didn't call her name. He just stood there, a dark figure against the fading light, letting his presence be known. For a moment, she didn't see him. She was lost in her own thoughts, her gaze on the cobbled street. And then, her head lifted, some primal instinct, some lingering echo of the bond, alerting her. Her eyes scanned the street, and then they found him. Time stretched, became thick and slow, like honey. He saw the precise moment she recognized him. Her body went rigid. The flicker of casual weariness in her eyes was instantly replaced by a stark, undiluted shock that was quickly followed by a wave of pure, cold fear. Her hand flew to her throat, a gesture of instinctual self-protection. Her face, already pale in the twilight, drained of all remaining color. She took a half-step back, her knuckles white where she clutched her shawl. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt. The sight of her fear, a fear he had put there, was more painful than any physical weapon. He had been her protector, the one who made her feel safe. Now he was the monster in her story. He had finally managed to look at her, and his gaze was a threat. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, letting her see him, letting her process the impossible reality of his presence in her new, quiet world. The diary pressed against his ribs, a silent promise. He had come not to drag her back, but to prove that he had finally learned to read her language, even if it was far, far too late. The space between them was 100 yards of cobblestone and 6 months of heartbreak. To Isla, it felt like both a mile and no distance at all. The sight of him was a physical shock, a lightning strike to her system that left her breathless and trembling. Matthias, here, in Saltwind. It was a collision of worlds she had worked so painstakingly to keep separate. Her past, a grand and painful fairy tale, had just stepped out of the shadows and into the quiet, mundane reality of her present. Her first instinct was to run, to turn and flee down the winding streets, to lose herself in the encroaching dusk and never look back. Her cottage, her sanctuary, was just up the cliff path, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, encased in lead. He wasn't moving. He wasn't striding toward her with the arrogant confidence of a king demanding the return of his property. He was just standing there, a statue of sorrow carved from the twilight. Even from this distance, she could see the change in him. The proud, unassailable posture was gone, replaced by a stillness that spoke of immense weariness. He looked haunted. Slowly, deliberately, he took a single step forward, then stopped, as if testing the air, waiting for her reaction. It was a gesture of such uncharacteristic hesitation that it disarmed her. The old Matthias would have crossed the distance in a blur of supernatural speed. This man was giving her space. He was giving her a choice. Her fear, sharp and piercing a moment ago, began to war with a bewildered curiosity. What did he want? Why now? She held her ground, wrapping her arms around herself, a fragile barricade against the tidal wave of emotion crashing within her. He took another slow step, and another, his eyes never leaving hers. The approach was an agony of suspense. With every footfall on the ancient stones, a memory surfaced. His hand in hers in the snow, his low laugh in the quiet of the library, the terrifying emptiness of his eyes in those final months. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. When he finally stopped, he was 10 feet away, close enough for her to see the devastating toll the past 6 months had taken on him. His face was leaner, the aristocratic planes and angles more severe, but it was his eyes that held her captive. The ancient, powerful silver eyes that had once held universes of affection for her were now filled with a raw, desperate pain that mirrored her own. There was no command in them, no expectation. There was only a profound, bottomless grief, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt he was truly, completely seeing her. Not the idea of his mate, not the queen, not an accessory to his life, but Isla, the woman standing before him, trembling in a worn wool shawl. Isla, he said. Her name was a rough, broken sound, as if he hadn't used his voice in years. It was not a command, but a plea. She couldn't find her own voice. It was trapped somewhere in her throat, strangled by a knot of tears she refused to shed. She just shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. No, don't do this. Don't you dare undo the fragile peace I've built. He seemed to understand. He didn't take another step. Instead, his hand moved slowly to the inside of his dark coat. She flinched, a primal part of her brain screaming danger, but he didn't produce a weapon. He drew out a small, leather-bound book. Her diary. The breath left her body in a rush. A wave of nausea and violation washed over her. He had read it. He had invaded the most private, sacred corner of her soul. The one place she had been able to be honest about her fading hope and crushing loneliness. A hot, furious anger surged through her, momentarily eclipsing the fear and sorrow. How could you, she finally whispered, her voice ragged. That was mine. It was, he agreed, his voice low and steady, imbued with a terrible sadness. And it was the only part of you I had left, the only part of you that would speak to me. He held it in his hand, not offering it, but just holding it as if it were a holy relic. I have read every word, 1,000 times. The anger inside her faltered, confused by the utter lack of defensiveness in his tone. He wasn't making excuses. He was stating a fact. I didn't come here to drag you back to a life that made you invisible, he continued, his gaze unwavering. I came here to apologize, not with words. You've heard all my words, and they were all meaningless. I came to show you. He took a deep breath, and the vulnerability in that simple human gesture was more potent than any declaration of love had ever been. On the third Tuesday of the harvest moon, 2 years ago, you wore the blue dress because you thought it matched my eyes. I didn't notice. I was distracted by a missive from the western provinces. I see the dress now, Isla. I see it every time I close my eyes. I see the hope on your face, and I see the exact moment it began to fade when I looked past you. Isla stared at him, stunned into silence. He wasn't just quoting from the diary. He was adding the context, the parts he had been blind to at the time. He was connecting her words to his own failures with a brutal, surgical precision. On the 12th of December, he went on, his voice gaining a quiet, rhythmic intensity. We walked in the snow. You wrote that you would hear my laugh in your dreams forever. I let that sound die, Isla. I forgot how to make it. I forgot that your hand in mine was warmer than any fire. Stop, she whispered. But the word had no force behind it. A part of her, a part she had thought long dead and buried, was listening. It was hanging on his every word, starved for this recognition, this proof that she hadn't imagined it all, that her pain had been real. You tried to show me the rose you named for my mother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was reading a report on grain tariffs. Tariffs, Isla. I chose paper and ink over the living, breathing miracle of you standing right in front of me. You felt transparent. I was the one who made you so. He finally took a step closer, and this time she didn't back away. He held out the diary. I have every page of this memorized. It is the litany of my sins. But it is also the story of a love I was too blind and arrogant to cherish. The final entry. He faltered, his composure cracking for the first time. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of agony. You said you were done being invisible. I am here because you were right. I am here to tell you that I see you. I see everything. I see the woman who loves first editions and the scent of old paper. I see the woman who hums off key when she gardens. I see the woman whose laugh made a mockery of 1,000 years of silence. I see the freckle beside your eye that wasn't there 6 months ago. I see you, Isla, and I am so sorry that it took losing you to finally open my eyes. He stood before her, stripped of all his power, all his pride. He was just a man holding the evidence of his own failure, offering his remorse with no guarantee of acceptance. He had brought her own heart back to her, every joyful beat and every painful crack, and was showing her that he had finally learned its rhythm. The anger had gone, washed away by a tide of sorrow so immense it threatened to drown them both. Tears were tracking silently down her cheeks, cold in the salty wind. He had seen her. After all this time, he had finally, truly seen her. She didn't fall into his arms. The chasm between them was too wide, carved too deep by months of neglect and weeks of lonely tears. A single apology, no matter how profound, could not build a bridge across it overnight. She looked at him, at the raw hope and terror warring in his silver eyes, and saw the truth of his words. He had changed. This broken, humble man was not the self-assured, distracted king she had left. But change and forgiveness were two very different things. You read my words, Matthias, she said, her voice quiet but steady. The tears on her cheeks were cold, but a spark of her old strength, the strength that had allowed her to walk away, was kindling within her. But my words are the past. They are a record of the pain you caused. They are not a map back to me. His face fell, the fragile hope in his eyes dimming. He looked as if she had physically struck him, but he nodded, accepting her verdict. I know. You say you see me now, she continued, taking a half step forward, closing the distance just enough to make her point clear. But seeing isn't a single act. It's not a grand gesture of recitation in a public street. It's the baker's wife remembering I like seeds on my rolls. It's Mr. Henderson at the post office setting aside the foreign stamps for me, because he knows I collect them. It's the quiet, everyday act of being present in someone's life. You were never present, Matthias. You were an overwhelming absence. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and she saw each one hit its mark. He didn't flinch or defend himself. He just stood there and took it, his head bowed slightly in acknowledgement of her truth. "So what now?" she asked, the question hanging in the cold, salt-laced air between them. "Do you expect me to pack my bags and return to the castle, to a life that nearly erased me? Do you expect me to believe that memorizing my pain is the same as learning how not to cause it?" "No," he said, his voice hoarse. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and the sincerity in them was absolute. "I expect nothing. I deserve nothing. I came here only to say what I needed to say, to let you know that your departure was not in vain. It woke me up. Whatever you choose to do now, that is your right. If you tell me to leave and never return, I will. I will spend eternity honoring that wish, knowing that your peace is more important than my own." And in that, she finally believed him. It was the first selfless thing he had said. He was giving her back the power he had taken from her, the power over her own life, the anger, the fear, the deep, resonant ache in her chest. It all swirled together into a confusing, exhausting vortex. A part of her, the pragmatic, wounded part, screamed at her to take him up on his offer. Tell him to go. Close the door on that chapter of her life forever. Reclaim her hard-won solitude. But another part of her, a foolish, stubborn part that still remembered the man who caught snowflakes on his tongue, hesitated. She looked at the diary in his hand, the chronicle of her heart. He had brought it all this way. He had learned it, lived with it. He hadn't come to demand. He had come to understand. And perhaps that was a foundation. Not a bridge, but the first stone of a new path, one they would have to build together, painstakingly. "I'm not coming back to the castle," she said, her tone firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "I understand," he said, his voice devoid of protest. This life, she gestured around them, at the quiet street, the distant sound of the waves. "This is my life now. It's small and it's quiet, and it's real. I am not giving it up. I would not ask you to." She took a deep breath, the decision forming in her mind, fragile and uncertain. It was a risk, a terrible, terrifying risk. But the sight of him, so broken and so utterly dedicated to his remorse, had cracked open a door she thought she had sealed forever. "You want to earn my trust back?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "You want to prove you can see me?" He nodded, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. "More than anything." "Then you do it here, on my terms." She watched him carefully, gauging his reaction. No king, no grand gestures, no promises of forever. "You will stay at your inn. You will not command me or shadow me or try to buy my forgiveness with priceless artifacts." She paused, letting the weight of her conditions settle. "You will earn me back one moment at a time, one genuine look at a time. You will learn the person I am now in this town, not the memory of the girl you lost." It was an impossible request. She was asking a centuries-old king to become an ordinary man, to subject himself to a slow, uncertain courtship with no guarantee of success. She was asking him to be patient, to be humble, to be present. She was asking him to do everything he had failed to do before. Matthias looked at her, at the strength in her jaw, the cautious hope in her tear-filled eyes. She was not offering him forgiveness. She was offering him a chance. A slim, perilous chance. It was more than he deserved. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. It didn't reach his eyes, the sadness was still too deep there, but it was a start. "One look at a time," he repeated, his voice filled with a quiet reverence, as if she had just given him the most sacred of vows. "I accept your terms, Isla." She gave a single sharp nod, not trusting herself to say more. She turned without another word and began the walk up the cliff path toward her cottage, her home. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on her, a tangible warmth on her shoulders. It wasn't the possessive, distracted gaze of the king. It was the attentive, hopeful gaze of Matthias. And for the first time in a very long time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like the barest possibility of being seen. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm, a delicate and unspoken dance. Matthias kept his word. He stayed at the inn, a quiet, solitary figure in the small harbor town. He did not approach her at the bookshop. He did not appear at her cottage door. There were no lavish gifts, no dramatic proclamations. His presence was a quiet, constant thing at the periphery of her life, a study in restraint she never would have thought him capable of. His first attempt came 3 days after their confrontation. It was just after she'd opened the shop. The morning was gray and damp, a typical salt wind day. The bell over the door chimed, and when she looked up from the ledger, he was standing there. He was not dressed as a king in exile, but in simple dark trousers and a thick woolen sweater that looked like it belonged to a local fisherman. In his hands, he held 2 steaming mugs. He didn't cross the threshold. He just stood in the doorway, the salty morning air swirling around him. "I thought you might be cold," he said, his voice soft, uncertain. "It's just tea, the way you like it. Strong, with a spoonful of honey, no milk." She stared at him, then at the mugs. It was such a small thing, a ridiculously small thing. But it was a detail he had remembered, not from the diary, but from their life. It was a piece of her he had carried with him. Her heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She came out from behind the counter and took one of the mugs from him. Her fingers brushed against his, and the brief contact was like a jolt of electricity, a reminder of the bond that still thrummed beneath the surface, dormant but not dead. His skin was cold, as always, but the warmth of the ceramic mug was a comforting anchor. He just nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He didn't try to prolong the moment, didn't push for more conversation. He simply gave her the tea, turned, and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of her shop with the ghost of his presence and the sweet scent of honey. She watched him go, the mug warming her hands, and felt the first tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. He learned to be present in small, unobtrusive ways. One afternoon, while she was shelving a new shipment of books, she saw him through the window, sitting on a bench across the square. He wasn't staring at her, not directly. He was reading a book of poetry he had purchased from her shop the day before, leaving the exact amount of coins on the counter while she was in the back room. He was simply sharing the space with her, existing in her world without demanding to be the center of it. Every now and then, he would look up, and his gaze would meet hers through the glass. He would offer a small, hesitant smile, and she, to her own surprise, would find herself returning it. One evening, as she was walking home along the cliff path, she found him waiting at a bend in the trail. Her first instinct was to tense, but he held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "The path is slick with sea spray tonight," he said, his voice carried on the wind. "I only wanted to be sure you made it home safely. I won't follow you." He stood there until she had reached her own front gate, a silent, watchful guardian against the encroaching dark. It was a gesture of protection, not possession. He was seeing a need, her safety, and meeting it without expectation of reward. It was a quiet echo of the man she had first fallen in love with, the one who had made her feel safe. They began to talk, not about the past, not about forgiveness or the future. They talked about the present. He would ask about her day, about the book she was reading, about the townspeople she now called her friends, and he listened. It was the most profound change of all. His eyes didn't glaze over. He didn't interrupt. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most fascinating person in the world. He would remember a name she mentioned, an anecdote she told, and bring it up days later. He was collecting the details of her new life, not as an archivist of her past pain, but as a student of her present self. One blustery afternoon, she closed the shop early and found him on the beach, staring out at the turbulent gray waves. She walked up beside him, pulling her shawl tight. For a long time, they stood in silence, the only sound the roar of the surf and the cry of the gulls. "I used to hate the sea," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I thought it was just a big, empty space, a barrier." "And now?" he asked, turning his head to look at her. He was seeing her, really seeing her, the way the wind whipped strands of hair across her face, the determined set of her jaw. "Now, I think it's a space for possibility," she admitted. "It's so vast. It makes your own problems seem small, manageable. It washes things clean." He nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. I understand. He bought her a small potted gardenia because he remembered she loved the scent. He learned the names of the regulars at her shop. He helped old Mr. Henderson mend his fishing nets. His preternatural strength a quiet, useful tool rather than a display of power. He was weaving himself into the fabric of her life, not by force, but with threads of patience and quiet consistency. He was letting her see him too, not the king, but Matthias, a man capable of humility, of service, of a deep and abiding remorse. The turning point came nearly 2 months after his arrival. It was a cold, clear night, the sky littered with a brilliant spray of stars. She had been unable to sleep and had walked out to the edge of the cliff behind her cottage. She found him there, already looking up at the sky. I remember you telling me their names, she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He turned to her, a sad smile on his face. I remember a woman who felt like a perfect shell held in the palm of a god. He was quoting her diary, but it wasn't an indictment anymore. It was a shared memory, a lament for what was lost. I was that woman, she said, her voice thick. I know, he said. He reached out, his movement slow, giving her ample time to pull away. He didn't try to take her hand. Instead, his fingers gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His touch was cold, but it sent a shock of warmth through her entire body. I am so sorry I made you forget. She looked up at him, at his face illuminated by the cold starlight, and the last of her defenses crumbled. The pain was still there, a scar on her heart that would likely never fade completely. But beneath it, something new was growing. A fragile, tentative trust. A quiet, hopeful love. It was not the same incandescent, naive love she'd had before. It was something stronger, more resilient, forged in the fires of loss and rebirth. You didn't make me forget, she whispered, leaning into his touch, a surrender and a choice all in one. You just made me build a new life to remember it in. He understood. He understood that she would not go back. Their future, if they were to have one, would not be in the cold, silent castle. It would be here, in this small town by the sea, a world built on quiet moments and small kindnesses. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. Then let me be a part of it, he murmured, his voice a raw plea against her skin. Let me spend the rest of eternity learning the names of these stars, with you. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, the cold, clean scent of night and eternity, now mingled with the salt of her sea. She raised her hands and framed his face, her thumbs stroking the sharp line of his jaw. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. He was looking at her, not through her, not past her. He was looking at her as if she were the only star in his sky. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would never look away again. One look at a time, Matthias, she whispered, her voice finally steady, finally sure. It starts with this one. And as he leaned in to kiss her, a kiss that was not a king's claim but a pilgrim's prayer, she knew that this was not an ending. It was not a return to the way things were. It was something far more precious. It was a beginning,